Loneliness will convince you to tolerate people you would never choose if you felt emotionally safe. Welcome to video 3 of Radiate, Don't Accommodate, which is all about friendship breakups. My next story is about Greg. Again, all names have been changed. I moved 4,000 miles from Chicago to Hawaii on my own in 2018. And I didn't have any friends when I moved here. But before I moved, and I was still in Chicago, one of my friends was in my neighborhood and she was getting the tire on her bike changed. So I met her at this total dive bar. It was full of construction workers who loved the idea of being in a bar with two girls. We were not as thrilled, so we holed up in the corner, chatting away, and this is when I was breaking the news to everybody that I was moving to Hawaii, and she was like all excited and happy for me, and she was like, you know what? I went to college with this guy, Greg, and he lives in Honolulu. Let me connect you to him. And right then and there, she pulls up his Facebook, and there were a ton of pictures of him in Hawaii, but he was always with this blonde girl, presumably his girlfriend. So I was like, well, if he has a girlfriend, he probably wouldn't be interested in hanging out, and I don't want to be a third wheel. And she was like, no, that's not his girlfriend. I'll connect you with him. I was doubtful, but she started a group text with the three of us, and girlfriend or not, he was excited to add me to his friend group. And up until the move, because I think this was a few months before I moved. So we were casually texting, and then like a week before I moved, he sent me a text and he was like, hey Ange, I'm at a cool party with my friends. It will be so much fun when you're here and can come with us next time. And again, when I tell these stories, it's not to criticize the other person, because anytime there's dysfunction in a relationship, we are also playing a role. And so my first red flag with Greg was when he texted me, he would call me Ange. And the only people who call me Ange are my close friends and family. So immediately I felt connected to him, but it was a false sense of connection because I was feeling desperate for friends. And then he kind of threw me something to latch onto, and I was like, ooh, I feel close to him. So that was a red flag on my part. And then I moved here, and after a few days of getting settled in, I texted him and I was like, hey, do you want to hang out? Because he seemed excited to hang out with me, but then once I got here, it was always an excuse. He was like, oh, I'm feeling under the weather this week. Cool. So then next week, I texted him again, and he had another excuse. And the next week, I text him again. He has another excuse. And initially, because I didn't have any friends, I had no shame in being desperate about it. But then after about a month of this, I texted him like, hey, do you want to hang out? And his response was, I'm going to be spending the weekend at my girlfriend's house in Kailua. And I was like, got it. Because I had suspected he had a girlfriend, so it wouldn't have been a surprise, but it's like, all he had to do was say so. So at that point, I was like, okay, I'm gonna lay off Greg and focus on getting other friends. But the problem was, in Chicago, I never had a problem making friends. I could make friends at the gym, at yoga, even places like Trader Joe's, but it was not that way here at all. I really struggled for a long time making friends. And so I was struggling for like several more weeks. And then like a month later, so this was like 2 months after I moved here, he texted me one day and he's like, hey, I know it's short notice, but do you want to meet me at happy hour this afternoon? And I was so lonely and desperate for human connection that I responded immediately, even though he had been dodging me for 2 months. And I was like, yeah, sounds good. I would love that. So another red flag on my part. And so I met Greg at happy hour, and we immediately developed rapport because he felt like talking to an old friend. But then he starts trauma dumping on me. He goes deep into like how his mom died when he was in high school and how he had a falling out with his dad. And he even changed his last name to his mom's last name to dissociate with his dad. And I'm aware of this psychology now, but usually when people overshare too soon, it's because they want to create a sense of closeness and like have a bond with someone. And because I was so desperate for friends, I was like the perfect, like quote unquote victim for that, because he just gave me a little bit to latch onto, and I was like, oh my God, I have a good friend now. Like I felt like he was my best friend. And in this conversation, he also confided to me about his girlfriend. Apparently, she was a cocaine addict as well as like many other things. So they were very on and off, because like she would go on these drug binges and like tell him how much she hated him and be really abusive to him. And then she would sober up and then apologize, and then he would take her back. And she was also extremely wealthy, because her extremely wealthy former husband, I don't know the appropriate language for you two, but he was no longer alive by his own hand. And so she inherited his fortune. So it was very clear to me from the conversation and things he was saying that he was very codependent on her for money and confidence. So I immediately understood why he had been so flaky. Not that I'm saying it's okay, but I was like, oh yeah, that's why he's been dodging me ever since I got here. But anyway, so Greg and I start hanging out more because I'm desperate for friends, but he only wants to hang out with me when him and his girlfriend are off. So I definitely get the impression that he's using me of being his surrogate girlfriend. And that becomes very apparent when we would hang out. He had certain expectations of how he wanted me to be, and then he would constantly nag me for not meeting those expectations. So for example, he liked to stay out until like 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I am not that kind of person at all. I've never been that kind of person. Even in my clubbing days in my early 20s, I would maybe stay out till like 2 or 3 in the morning. So it just became very tiring for me, because when I hung out with him, I just wanted to be me, and he was always nagging me for not meeting his expectations. And through hanging out with him more, I realized that he and I were a lot alike, because he reminded me of how I was, because before I moved to Hawaii, I got out of an 8-year toxic relationship, and his behaviors reminded me of how I was being in that relationship and how toxic I was. So this friendship was actually helpful for me in that way, because I was able to see that I wasn't accepting my ex for how he was, and just have a better understanding of myself. So he served as a mirror to help me heal some things in myself. But even though it was a friendship relationship, even though it was not healthy, I knew it was not healthy, and I knew it wasn't going to be like this long-lasting great friendship, and I knew it was going downhill fast. But again, I was still relatively new to the island, and I didn't have any other friends, so I was desperate for his friendship. And this is why it is essential to love yourself and your energy so much that you don't need anything outside of yourself to fill your loneliness. It never ends well, and that goes for platonic and romantic relationships. So as this dysfunctional dynamic continues, I started to have weird health issues with my tongue. It would get randomly all red and swollen. Like when you burn your tongue when you eat something hot, that's how it felt all over my tongue. And I was going to these doctors and they couldn't figure it out. They kept giving me different prescriptions that weren't working. And then finally I went to this doctor who was like, oh, it might be lupus. Like before he even did the biopsy or anything. And I'm like, why are you saying this? And so I'm having health issues with my tongue. Also, when I moved to Hawaii, I kept my job in Chicago and was working remotely. And I was getting up at 4 a.m. Monday through Friday, which was hard to adjust to. So I was always exhausted and I didn't want to go out every weekend. So this entire time, I'm not hanging out with Greg, but him and his girlfriend are off. So he wants me to hang out with him and he keeps nagging me to hang out with him. And I'm like, hey, I can't. I tell him about the issues I'm having with my tongue. I tell him about how I'm exhausted from waking up at 4 a.m. And he's like, you're no fun. You never come out anymore. And are like, well, hopefully you're ready to come out next weekend. And it was just so invalidating of my experience because he always made it about him. And I just never felt accepted for who I was. And so finally, Greg invited me out. There was this event. I don't know if it still happens. It's called Art After Dark at the Art Museum. So he invited me out and I was like, fine, I'll go so that he'll stop nagging me, which again, red flag on my part because that was not a reason I should have been going. So I finally went out and was staying out late the entire night. He was like, you never hang out anymore. You never come out. You need to come out more. And I lost my shit. I went off on him. I was like, Greg, I'm here right now and you aren't even appreciating it because you're too busy complaining about how I haven't been hanging out, even though I told you a gazillion times I'm having health issues and I'm exhausted from getting up at 4 a.m. Plus, and I was trying to explain to him, I'm not a partier like you. I don't hang out until 4 a.m. And then he got mad at me for being mad. And he was like, I just wish you would come out more. And I never forget this feeling. I went home and I had so much anxiety that my chest felt like it was in a death grip because he was really my only friend at that time. So I didn't want to stop hanging out with him. So I still had that part of me that was like desperate for the connection. But that night I was like, I have to stop hanging out with him because he wants me to be someone that I'm not. And his lack of boundaries is suffocating. So in that moment, I decided that I was done being friends with him, just like that. And it felt like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders because that friendship was so toxic that it actually felt like a relief to me. That being said, it still hurt because I had to move on with my life without any close friends, and it felt very lonely and isolating, and it wasn't easy. So my point in saying this is sometimes the best choice doesn't immediately feel good, and that's okay, because part of being a functional adult is learning to feel safe in your body while feeling your feelings. So this is the part that I'm embarrassed to admit, but I ended the friendship by ghosting him. And I don't regret it, but if I could go back, I would do it differently because I do think there could have been a different way. My reasoning for doing it is because generally he wasn't open, and I knew this from experience, he wasn't open to hearing about my experience because he would always make it about what he wanted. But in hindsight, I do wish I would have called or texted and still given him an explanation because I do believe he deserved to have closure. And maybe he didn't care because again, I never talked to him again, so I don't know if he even cared or not. But my personal opinion is that ghosting is a cowardly way to end things. So for my own personal integrity, I would have done it differently, but it doesn't matter. And I don't know if he would have agreed with me or not, but that part doesn't matter either. So here is your action step for this video. When you are spending time with your friend, seriously ask yourself, do I even like this person? Or is it comfortable, historical, or convenient? So for instance, with Greg, it was convenient because I didn't have any other friends and I was lonely and desperate for friends. Sometimes the reason is, well, we've been friends since second grade. And sometimes the reason is, and I talked about this in my dating series if you haven't watched this, but until you heal yourself and your childhood wounds, you will seek romantic partners that remind you of your parents to get the love that you needed and wanted from your parents. So that is why it's so important to heal yourself before you get in a romantic relationship so that you're not treating your partner like a parent. And even though it's usually not as intense, those same dynamics can play out in platonic friendships because you're familiar with a certain dysfunction, so you tolerate that in platonic friendships. So seriously ask yourself, do I even like this person? Because it could be the friendship is based on familiarity because they remind you of familiar dysfunctional environments. Also, for extra credit, ask yourself, do they accept me for who I am, not just when I'm being easy or fun or who they want me to be? Because loneliness is powerful, trust me, I know, but it is not a reason to abandon yourself. Platonic or romantic, it never ends well. So ask yourself, do I even like this person? And do they accept me for who I am? And I will see you in the next video, which is video 4 in the Radiate, Don't Accommodate series.